Our theme this year is the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 16:9. Before I kind of get into the sermon and talk about this, I want to talk about our process that we've been talking about for several months now. And that begins with loving our neighbors, getting into the lives of people who are our neighbors, getting into their homes, getting them into our homes, and establishing those friendships. And then getting them to worship, getting them to fall in love with God, moving them in that direction, and then finally moving them, as well as all of us, into service, serving other people, lifting up our sleeves and helping people who need it. Again, our theme, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his step. It's our heart. Today we're going to talk about our heart. That's what makes plans. We have to make plans. Those plans change, and God is the one who establishes or directs our steps. The heart is an interesting thing. The heart is kind of the storehouse of our emotions, right? We have sayings like, I feel it in my heart, or my heart is moved. Thank you for that little illustration there. My heart is moved, right? It's a storehouse of emotions, but it's also the epicenter of our emotions. We have emotions, good and bad, that stem from our heart. They begin in the heart and they move outward. People who target people, both for good and bad, they begin with their heart. They don't start with the intellect, they start with the heart. They try to get to people's emotions and really get to that epicenter, that storehouse of emotions. I think for normal people, our hearts are really moved when we see people in trouble. I think that I can probably speak for about 100% of us here, that when we see people in trouble, it actually affects us. It affects our heart. It affects our emotions. We want to reach out, if nothing else, at least in sympathy. If there's nothing that we can do to help people physically, in sympathy, our hearts go out to people. I think this past week, I think the whole world's heart has gone out to the people of Ukraine. We've seen an unnecessary war. Our kids talk about it. There's this heightened awareness that there's something wrong going on with this war. When we see the pictures and we see the amount of destruction and the type of destruction to innocent people, what the evil mind is capable of, it affects our heart. It raises up all kinds of emotions within us, and rightfully so. We should feel that pain. We should feel that sorrow. And I think the big litmus test, in other words, the one thing that determines whether you have a heart or not, is whether your compassion is aimed not towards yourself when you're in trouble, but towards others. Are you willing to enter into the pain and the sorrow of other people? Or do you say, well, I'll be thinking about you. I'll be praying for you. And then do you move on as if nothing ever happened? See, when it happens to us, when heartbreak happens to us, whether it's a broken relationship, something that happens within the family, something that's pulling on the heartstrings, of course we're going to feel that pain. Of course we're going to be affected. Of course we're going to be sympathetic towards ourselves. We're going to be understanding of ourselves. We're going to be patient with ourselves. But the litmus test is, do you have that same amount of passion when it's happening to somebody else? I don't like to see suffering. I do a lot of stuff with abuse and in ministry. You see all kinds of things. You enter into people's pain pretty routinely. I think that's pretty normal for people in ministry, probably even just people in life in general. I mentioned during class, we prayed for my oldest sister. She's been in intensive care for over a week now. She's very critical. There were a couple days we didn't know whether she was going to make it or not. My brother Joe and I went up to visit her on Thursday, just a few days ago. And, she was awake. She was talking to us. She was somewhat, I say somewhat, she was pretty aware, though a little bit confused. But she looked at me at one point and she, kind of emotionless, and she said, "I guess this is my wake-up call." And I felt that. And I started crying, and, I looked at her and I said, there's nobody in the family who is not just rooting you on all the way. We love you and we're praying for you and we want to see you get better, and we feel the pain that you're feeling. We feel that in our heart. And there's this story, before we get into the text, there's this story where Jesus is for a long time just blasting the Pharisees. And he's telling them, your hearts are not right. You guys are hypocrites. You guys are doing all the motions of religion. You're praying, you're fasting, you're going to be seen in the marketplace, you sound good, you articulate yourselves well, you do all these things, but you're ripping people off. You're destroying people's lives. And he starts naming all these things. And the lawyers, the scribes, they come back and they hear Jesus just blasting the Pharisees. And they say, well, what about us? Do you feel that way about us? And Jesus says, as a matter of fact, I do. And he just goes into this big, long tirade about the scribes, about the lawyers. And he says, you guys are ripping people off. You're deceiving people. You're doing all these things. And he lays this out for a really long time. And then the scriptures say that the people were looking for a way to trip him up. And then we get into our text. This is in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 1. In the meantime, when so many thousands of people, the word used is multitudes. A multitude is 10,000 people. It's a unit that was used in the Greek language. Multitude meant 10,000 people. Luke says that there were multitudes of people, so quite literally tens of thousands of people. In the meantime, when tens of thousands of people had gathered together, that they were trampling one another. I want you guys to stop for a second and think about this scene. This is not hearsay. This is not something that was happening off, in the margins. They were witnessing this happen. I don't know about you, but I picture the scene, and Luke doesn't tell us whether anybody died or not. We don't know. But when you have that many people pressing in on each other and people are being literally trampled, right? We had something happen just a month or two ago at a concert where people were trampled and died. And this isn't a concert. This isn't people there who are excited about seeing their idol. These are people who are desperate. They're already desperate because they're trying to get to Jesus because they're poor, they're sick, they're hungry, they're desperate, and they're craving to get to Jesus, to find some kind of relief in their life. If that doesn't affect you emotionally, I don't know what does. But not only are they desperate to get to Jesus, they're so desperate that they're rushing to get to Jesus. And a crowd that big, it doesn't end well. You can't move that fast when you have tens of thousands of people. And so people are literally being trampled in front of Jesus and his disciples. They're witnessing people being run over by the crowds, quite possibly killed, most definitely broken bones, all kinds of serious injuries. And here's what Luke says. He began to say to his disciples first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. which is hypocrisy. You know what I think in my mind? You know what I would have been thinking if I was one of the disciples? Yeah, I know that, Jesus. You just were talking about hypocrisy. You were blasting the Pharisees. We get that. We'll talk about that later, but right now, people are being killed. They're being trampled. People are being mowed over. These people are desperate. Jesus, can't you stop this? Won't you stop it? Will you stop the crowds? Will you help these people? Don't you have any compassion? Where's your heart? Where's the litmus test right now, Jesus? Don't you care that these people are being trampled? You're talking about leaven. That has nothing to do with these people being trampled. That has nothing to do with people who are sick and hungry and tired and desperate to get to you. It has nothing to do with that. And when you first read this, it almost seems like Luke had a moment of confusion, and he writes this, and it doesn't really fit. It doesn't fit into the story. It's like, why when people are being trampled, is Jesus turning, and Luke is intentional about it. He turns first to his disciples. He began to say to his disciples first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. Can you imagine, as the scene is unfolding right in front of your very eyes, this is the conversation that Jesus chooses to have with you? I don't know if you guys know, if you've worked with yeast, leaven very much. Natalie and I just worked last night together. We made some homemade dough. We made these pretzel rolls. We make a lot of homemade bread in our house, so we work with yeast a good bit. And yeast is kind of an interesting thing because you have to kind of wake it up, right? Any of you who are bakers and you've worked with yeast, you put the warm water in. It's got to be warm. It can't be too cold. It can't be too hot. If it's too cold, the yeast doesn't wake up. If it's too hot, it kills the yeast. So you have to have that sweet spot around 105 degrees. You wake up the yeast. You let it sit for 5 minutes. You kind of whisk it. And you put the sugar in, and then it activates, and you can see it. It's like getting angry, right? And then you put your flour in, and you know once you put that first scoop in, you can never take the yeast out of that flour. It's in there. And it's going to attack it, and it's going to do its thing. And so when you knead the dough and you let it sit for about an hour, what happens? It grows, doesn't it? It affects all of the flour. It affects the whole dough, and it rises. And it actually gets warm. If you touch it, you can feel it. It's heating up as the yeast is doing its thing. You can't remove the yeast from the flour. Once you put that flour in, you cannot separate them. It's impossible. And the disciples knew this. And this is my opinion, but I think what's happening is the disciples saw this crowd that was pressing in. This was not unusual. We've been talking about this in class. These crowds were massive. They were desperate. They were hungry. They were tired. They needed to get to Jesus. They would do anything to get to Jesus, to get relief. And I think the disciples were very moved by that. I think that seeing these scenes over and over again, it doesn't make you calloused. I think it makes you emotional. I think these scenes add to the storehouse of those emotions that are in your heart, and you can't help but to have compassion on these people. When you see that many thousands of people, and guys, we don't know what that's like here. We really don't. In America, to see thousands of people or tens of thousands of people so desperate that they're crushing each other literally, we don't know what that's like here. We don't know what that's like in this country. We are blessed and we're spoiled, quite frankly. But I think when you witness this, it does something inside of you. It does something inside of your heart. And it breaks you on a level that I don't know that there's any coming back from that. Not necessarily in a bad way, but it moves you to help people. It moves you to action. It moves you to have compassion on people. And I think so desperately the disciples wanted to reach in there and help the people who are being trampled. They wanted to help the people who are desperate. And I think Jesus used that as a moment to say, you see this crowd of people, you see all these people who are desperate, you see all these people who are hungry and starving, and they don't stand a chance to make it in life without a helping hand from somebody else. You see this desperation. People like the Pharisees will permanently mess their lives up if you don't intervene, if you don't stop them, or if you become one of the Pharisees. You're like that little piece of leaven that gets in there and it spreads within that group. And guys, we see this over and over and over again. It doesn't take much to screw up the lives of a lot of people. It's incredible how much damage one person can do to many, 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 many lives. And I think Jesus has given them a double warning. One is that you find the Pharisees, you find the hypocrites who are pretending to be good people, but privately they berate people, they shame people, they harass people, they rip people off at the temple. You find those people and you shut them down. You get rid of them. You keep them at bay. You keep them away from people like these people who are genuinely just trying to make it in life. You be protectors of the innocent and the vulnerable. I think that's message number one. And I think message number two is don't become like the Pharisees. Guard that storehouse that is your heart. Guard those emotions and this compassion that you feel for the crowd right now. Don't ever lose it. Don't lose that compassion for people. It's interesting in this passage, he's addressing them. He's saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. But then listen what he does with his language. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever, who? You, not them. Whatever you have whispered, or whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light. Whatever you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. He's telling them, guard your hearts and be sincere, be genuine all the time. Keep the bad leaven out and let the good leaven in. I think we're witnessing something astronomical right now. In the midst of this war, the Ukrainians are getting the praise of everybody around the world for their courage. Zelensky is getting praise, and rightfully so, all across the world. He told our president, who offered to extricate him, he said, I don't need a ride, I don't need transportation, I need ammunition. I'm staying with my people, and I'm going to fight. And he's being praised for that courage. And that courage is, it's addictive. People catch that spirit of courageousness, of courage. I don't know if you saw this, but there's a newlywed couple in the Ukraine, young couple. They sped up their wedding, they got married, and they're standing there holding guns. They're armed, and they said, we wanted to hurry up and get married, and we're not going on a honeymoon. We're going to fight this battle for our people. That courage spreads. Just like the bad leaven that gets in there, Jesus is not just talking about the bad things. He's saying, be careful what you say in private, the way you talk to people, because that's going to spread. Once it's in there, once that's in somebody's life, it's going to spread, and there is no stopping it. And I think that's really relevant back to our theme, that the heart of man, our storehouse of emotions, plans our way. But the Lord establishes our steps. Let our hearts be helpful. Let our hearts be compassionate. Let our hearts be moved. And when we see people, let's have compassion on them and guard them from people who would otherwise hurt them, and keep the bad leaven out. The message is yours. If there's anybody today who has not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, or if you have prayer needs, we would invite you to come up as we all stand and sing together.